Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time, not to some epic battle or a scandalous royal affair, but to the slow, agonizing, and truly bizarre decline of one of England's most famous kings, Henry VIII Tudor. Imagine yourself, if you will, not as a casual observer, but as a shadow in the opulent, yet increasingly stifling, halls of Hampton Court Palace. You're there as the youthful, athletic prince transforms, day by day, year by year, into a grotesque caricature of his former self. You'll witness the gradual decay, not just of a body, but of a mind. It's a story so steeped in the macabre, so filled with uncomfortable details, that you probably won't survive this without a few shivers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always cool to see where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, or rather, our long, slow historical nightmare, begins not with a dying king, but with a vibrant, almost impossibly perfect prince. You're stepping back to 1509, and the air crackles with anticipation. The old king, Henry VII, has finally shuffled off this mortal coil, and in his place steps a strapping, athletic young man of just 17. This isn't the corpulent, angry monarch you probably picture. This is Henry VIII in his prime. You see him perhaps on the jousting field, a picture of chivalric romance. He's tall, over 6 feet, a giant for his age, with broad shoulders and a powerful build. His hair, a vibrant reddish gold, catches the sunlight as he effortlessly guides his warhorse. He excels at everything: hunting, wrestling, tennis, a game he invented, or at least heavily popularized. He plays the lute, composes music, speaks multiple languages, and has a sharp, inquisitive mind. He's the Renaissance prince personified, the darling of England, and the hope of a nation weary of his father's parsimonious ways. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief and joy that sweeps through the court. Everyone loves this new king. He's generous, throwing lavish feasts, commissioning beautiful art, and spending money with the joyful abandon of someone who's never had to worry about a budget in his life. He marries Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, a match that seems to cement the alliance with Spain and promises stability. She's older, serious, and deeply pious, but initially, their union appears solid, built on genuine affection and mutual respect. This is the mainstream historical fact of Henry's early reign, a period of immense popularity and seemingly boundless potential. He's the epitome of a golden age, or at least the beginning of one. But even then, if you look closely, if you really pay attention to the little quirks, you might spot the first faint flickers of the man he would become. For instance, despite his seemingly effortless charm, he had an almost obsessive need for control. You might notice how he meticulously organized his hunting parties, how he demanded perfection from his musicians, or how he would occasionally erupt in a furious temper when things didn't go precisely his way. This wasn't the raging tyrant yet, just the spoiled, powerful youth unaccustomed to being gainsaid. It's almost like watching a perfectly tuned engine, knowing somewhere in the back of your mind that a tiny, unfixable flaw exists within its core. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Henry was utterly fascinated by horoscopes and prophecies. Despite his outward piety and his later crackdown on superstition, he secretly consulted astrologers and believed in the alignment of the stars. Imagine the mighty king, after a day of jousting and feasting, sneaking off to pore over charts and cryptic predictions, hoping to divine his future. It's a strange juxtaposition, isn't it? The man who would later declare himself the supreme head of the church, dismissing centuries of religious tradition, still found comfort in the esoteric arts. It reminds you that even the most powerful individuals are still just people, grappling with the unknown in whatever way they can. It's a little like someone today meticulously checking their daily horoscope before making a big decision, only with vastly higher stakes. As you drift through these early years, Witnessing the endless tournaments and the intellectual debates, you might hear whispers, subtle disagreements among the learned men of the court. Historians still argue whether Henry's initial break with Rome was purely a matter of dynastic succession or if there were deeper theological currents pulling him toward Protestant ideas even in these early years. Was it a calculated political move, driven by desperation for an heir, or was there a genuine shift in his religious convictions that paved the way for the Reformation? You see the subtle influences around him, the advisors who championed new ideas, the scholars who debated the interpretations of Scripture. It's a complex tapestry, and the threads of his personal desires and burgeoning theological leanings are already starting to intertwine. For now, however, the court glows with youthful promise, blissfully unaware of the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. As you continue your silent observation, gliding through the early years of Henry's reign, you sense a subtle shift in the court's atmosphere, a growing anxiety that begins to overshadow the youthful exuberance. The king and Catherine of Aragon, for all their initial affection, face a profound and persistent problem: the lack of a living male heir. You see Catherine endure multiple pregnancies, a heartbreaking litany of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants who barely cling to life before fading away. Each loss, each tiny coffin, ratchets up the pressure on the royal couple and on the stability of the Tudor dynasty itself. For Henry, a king utterly obsessed with his legacy and the continuation of his line, this becomes an all-consuming torment. You witness his desperation growing with each failed pregnancy. He needs a son, not just for his ego, but because the recent memory of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil conflict sparked by succession disputes, looms large. A daughter, while loved, simply isn't considered a strong enough guarantee of peace and stability in a male-dominated world. Mary, their surviving daughter, is a bright and intelligent child, but the idea of a queen regnant is still a relatively untested and often feared concept. The weight of this expectation presses down on Henry, twisting his once charming demeanor. His eyes begin to wander, and you observe his growing fascination with the women of the court, particularly those who possess a certain vivacity and independence. But it's not simply a wandering eye that drives him. It's a theological dilemma that starts to consume him. He begins to interpret the biblical passage from Leviticus 20:21, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, is an unclean thing, they shall be childless," as God's judgment upon his marriage to Catherine. You might see him poring over Latin texts, consulting with scholars, his brow furrowed in genuine spiritual anguish, or perhaps a highly convenient spiritual anguish. He genuinely believes, or at least convinces himself he believes, that his marriage is cursed, and that only by annulling it can he secure a legitimate male heir and appease God. This becomes the infamous Great Matter, the single mainstream historical fact that will reshape England. You watch as Henry dispatches emissaries to Rome, pleading with Pope Clement VII for an annulment. The diplomatic dance is agonizingly slow, complicated by European politics, especially the fact that Catherine is the aunt of the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who holds the Pope virtually captive after sacking Rome. Imagine the frustration building in Henry, a man used to getting his own way, as he encounters the immovable obstacle of papal authority and international diplomacy. You can almost feel his rage simmering beneath the surface, a dangerous heat ready to erupt. Here's a quirky tidbit about this period. During the initial phases of the Great Matter, before the full break with Rome, Henry considered some truly bizarre legal arguments. One lesser-known avenue explored was whether Catherine's marriage to his brother Arthur had actually been consummated. Imagine the legal minds of Europe debating, in hushed tones, the intimate details of a long-dead prince and princess. It's almost comical in its invasiveness and desperation, a last-ditch effort to find a loophole in canon law, short of openly defying the Pope. You can picture the uncomfortable glances, the shuffling feet of the learned men forced to discuss such delicate matters. As the years drag on, and Rome offers no satisfactory solution. You see Henry's patience completely fray. The once charming prince becomes increasingly autocratic, his demands more insistent. He begins to entertain the radical idea that he, as king, holds ultimate spiritual authority within his own realm, an idea that had been bubbling beneath the surface of European thought for some time. Historians still argue whether Henry genuinely believed in his divine right to override papal authority, or if this assertion was simply a convenient justification for his personal desires and political ambitions. Was it a carefully constructed theological position, or merely a king stamping his foot and declaring, "My will be done"? You watch the debates unfold in the royal council, sometimes hushed and fearful, sometimes passionately delivered by those eager to gain the king's favor. The stakes are immense, not just for Henry, but for the very soul of England. The wheels are turning, slowly at first, but with an inexorable momentum that will soon crash through centuries of tradition. The air around Henry now crackles with a new kind of tension, a desperate energy fueled by the stalemate with Rome. You can feel the shift, the king's frustration curdling into something more dangerous, more absolute. And into this volatile atmosphere steps a figure who, though not yet queen, already casts an immense shadow in Boleyn. You observe her, not as the caricature of history, but as a young woman of fierce intelligence and captivating charm. She's not conventionally beautiful by the standards of the day, not the demure, pale ideal, but she possesses a wit and a vibrancy that utterly mesmerizes Henry. Her dark eyes, her quick mind, her refusal to be just another mistress, these are the qualities that set her apart. You might see her moving through the court, always impeccably dressed, often surrounded by a lively circle of admirers and intellectuals. She had spent time in the more sophisticated courts of France and the Netherlands, absorbing a culture of intellectual curiosity and fashion that was far ahead of England's. This exposure made her worldly, articulate, and perhaps a little daring. She engages the king in conversations about theology, about court politics, about the very nature of kingship, in a way that none of his previous dalliances had. She is not merely an object of desire. She is an intellectual companion, and for Henry, this is a potent combination. Her strategy, whether calculated or simply born of her own convictions, is clear. She will not be his mistress. She will be his queen or nothing. You see the king, increasingly infatuated, agreeing to this unprecedented demand. This, of course, intensifies the great matter to an unbearable degree. It's no longer just about a male heir. It's about Henry's desperate desire for this woman, and for the legitimate children she might bear him. The pursuit of an Boleyn becomes inextricably linked with the pursuit of an annulment, transforming a legalistic theological debate into a passionate and highly personal crusade. Her ascendancy is a mainstream historical fact that sent shockwaves across Europe. You watch as it consolidates her position, her family, the Boleyns and Howards, rising with her. They become the dominant faction at court, replacing the aging and increasingly frustrated Cardinal Wolsey, who had failed to secure the annulment. Wolsey's fall is spectacular and swift, a stark warning of the king's ruthlessness when thwarted. He is stripped of his power, his wealth, and dies shortly thereafter, leaving a vacuum that Anne and her supporters are quick to fill. This period marks a dramatic power shift, as new men, often reformers in their own right, begin to advise the king, subtly pushing him towards a definitive break with Rome. And here's a quirky tidbit about Anne. She had a noticeable sixth finger or a rudimentary extra digit on one hand. While often exaggerated by her detractors, it was a physical detail that some saw as a sign of witchcraft or abnormality, especially after her fall from grace. Imagine the whispers, the nervous glances, as courtiers tried to subtly discern this imperfection. In an age steeped in superstition, even a minor physical difference could be twisted into something sinister, a testament to the precariousness of power and public perception. It's a reminder that even queens were scrutinized for every perceived flaw. As you observe Anne's growing influence, You might hear the murmurs of discontent, the quiet debates among the older nobility and conservative elements of the court. Historians still argue whether Anne Boleyn was a devout reformer in her own right, genuinely committed to the new religious ideas filtering into England, or if her interest in Protestantism was primarily pragmatic, serving as a political tool to justify the annulment and secure her position. You see her promoting the circulation of English translations of the Bible, encouraging sermons that criticize papal authority, and surrounding herself with reform-minded scholars. Was she a true believer, or simply a shrewd manipulator of religious currents for her own advancement? The answer likely lies in a complex blend of both, much like Henry's own motivations. Regardless, her presence irrevocably set England on a path towards religious upheaval, shattering centuries of established order. With Anne Boleyn firmly established by his side, Henry VIII's patience with Rome evaporates entirely. You sense the final, irreversible crack in the ancient edifice of the Catholic Church in England. No longer content to merely request an annulment, the king now moves to assert his absolute authority, dismantling the very foundations of papal power within his realm. This pivotal shift, the English Reformation, begins in earnest, not with a theological uprising from the populace, but as a top-down revolution dictated by the king's personal will and dynastic ambition. You observe the flurry of activity in Parliament, as a series of acts are passed that systematically strip the Pope of his power. The Act in Restraint of Appeals in 1533 is particularly significant. It declares that this realm of England is an empire, meaning it has its own supreme head, accountable to no foreign power. This paves the way for Henry to marry Anne Boleyn in secret, then openly, with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, declaring his marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void. You witness the dramatic coronation of Anne Boleyn as Queen of England, a spectacle designed to assert her legitimacy and defy the world. The bells peal, the crowds cheer, though perhaps with some underlying apprehension, and a new era is undeniably ushered in. The real earthquake, however, comes with the Act of Supremacy in 1534. This is the mainstream historical fact that fundamentally redefines the relationship between church and state in England. You hear the words, echoing through the great halls of Westminster, declaring Henry VIII to be the supreme head of the Church of England on earth. This isn't just a title. It's a radical assertion of power that places the king above the Pope, giving him ultimate authority over doctrine, appointments, and the vast wealth of the Church. Imagine the astonishment, the fear, the exhilaration that must have rippled through the populace. Centuries of religious tradition, of allegiance to Rome, are suddenly overturned by royal decree. This act demands an oath of loyalty from all subjects, and those who refuse, like the brilliant scholar Sir Thomas More or the resolute Bishop John Fisher, face the grim reality of the Tower of London and ultimately execution. You see the chilling precision with which dissent is crushed, a sign of the king's growing intolerance for any challenge to his absolute authority. The scaffold becomes a grim, recurring motif in this new, turbulent landscape. Now for a quirky tidbit that often gets overlooked. During the dissolution of the monasteries, which followed the Act of Supremacy, one of the more unusual items confiscated and meticulously inventoried by the crown was a collection of saints' relics. Imagine the detailed lists: a feather from the wing of the Archangel Gabriel, a vial of the Virgin Mary's milk, or even part of the actual true cross. While often dismissed as pious frauds today, these relics were immensely valuable and cherished by pilgrims. The crown's agents, pragmatic and thorough, recorded them all, even as they disdained their spiritual value. It's a strange mix of the sacred and the very mundane, a practical accounting of belief. It almost makes you wonder if they kept any for themselves, just in case. As the monasteries, those ancient bastions of wealth and learning, are systematically dissolved, you see the vast lands and treasures flowing into the royal coffers. This immense influx of wealth temporarily stabilizes the crown's finances, but it also creates a new class of landowners, men who profited from the destruction of the old order and whose loyalty was now firmly tied to the new one. Historians still argue whether the dissolution of the monasteries was primarily an act of religious reform aimed at rooting out corruption and superstition, or if it was predominantly a cynical financial maneuver to enrich the crown and its supporters. Was it a necessary purification of the church, or simply a massive land grab thinly veiled by theological justification? You observe the conflicting reports from the royal commissioners, some detailing genuine abuses, others painting an overly grim picture to justify their actions. The truth, like so much of history, is rarely black and white, but shades of deep, conflicting interests. The tumultuous years surrounding the English Reformation and the rise of Anne Boleyn eventually give way to a new, swift, and utterly brutal turn of the wheel. You witness the dramatic and shockingly rapid downfall of Anne, a woman who had dared to stand against the tide of tradition and who, tragically, failed to deliver the one thing Henry truly desired: a living, legitimate son. Her inability to produce a male heir after her coronation, only a daughter, Elizabeth, and then several devastating miscarriages sealed her fate. The king's gaze, ever restless, now sought another. You observe the subtle shift in Henry's affections, the growing coldness towards and replaced by a nascent interest in Jane Seymour. Jane is, in many ways, Anne's antithesis, quiet, demure, and seemingly untainted by the political machinations that surrounded her predecessor. She embodies the traditional virtues of womanhood, a stark contrast to Anne's sharp wit and independent spirit. You might see her in the background of court events, her pale, composed face a picture of serene piety, drawing the king's eye precisely because she seems to offer the calm stability that Anne, in her vibrant ambition, could not. The accusations against Anne Boleyn are shocking in their scope and absurdity. Adultery, incest with her brother, witchcraft, and treason. You can almost feel the collective gasp of the court as these charges are laid bare. While the historical consensus is that these charges were fabricated, a desperate legal maneuver to rid Henry of a queen who had outlived her usefulness, they served their purpose. You witness the quick, brutal trials, the condemnations, and finally, the swift execution of Anne Boleyn at the Tower of London in May 1536. This is a mainstream historical fact that remains one of the most chilling episodes of Henry's reign, a testament to his ruthless determination and the absolute power he wielded. The axe falls, and with it, the brief, blazing comet that was Anne Boleyn is extinguished. Within days of Anne's execution, Henry marries Jane Seymour. You see the haste, almost an indecency, in the speed of the new union. But for Henry, it is a matter of desperate urgency. He needs a son, and Jane, with her quiet demeanor and seemingly fertile promise, embodies that hope. And then, a miracle, or so it seemed to the king, Jane becomes pregnant. You watch as Henry, with bated breath, awaits the outcome. And then, on October 12th, 1537, the joyous news breaks. A son is born, Edward VI. You feel the explosion of relief and celebration that sweeps through the court and indeed through England. Cannons fire, bells peal, and feasts are held. Henry, now a father to a healthy male heir, is beside himself with joy. He has achieved what he craved above all else. This is the quirky tidbit of this story. The seemingly perfect irony that the queen who gave him his heart's desire would be the only one he truly seemed to mourn. However, this joy is tragically short-lived. Just 12 days after giving birth, Jane Seymour succumbs to puerperal fever, or childbed fever, a common and often fatal complication of childbirth in that era. You witness the profound grief that genuinely consumes Henry. For all his ruthlessness, his affections, when given, were deep. Jane, the quiet, obedient queen who delivered his male heir, becomes the ideal wife in his memory, the one he holds up as the standard against which all future wives will be measured. She is, significantly, the only one of his 6 wives to be buried beside him. As you reflect on this bittersweet triumph, you might hear the quiet academic debates. Historians still argue whether Jane Seymour's death was genuinely mourned as a personal tragedy by Henry, or if his outward display of grief was largely performative, a calculated move to garner sympathy and cement the image of the virtuous, dutiful queen who fulfilled her purpose. Did he truly love her, or did he simply appreciate her compliance and her ultimate, successful delivery of an heir? You observe the conflicting accounts, some speaking of his genuine despair, others noting how quickly he began to consider new marital prospects despite his mourning. The truth is likely a complex tapestry of both genuine emotion and shrewd political calculation, a hallmark of Henry's complex character. The brief period of celebratory relief following Edward's birth and Jane Seymour's tragic death soon dissipates, and you watch as Henry, despite having his longed-for male heir, begins to feel the familiar itch of loneliness and the political necessity of a new marriage. England, having broken with Rome, now finds itself somewhat isolated on the European stage. Alliances are crucial, and a new queen could forge vital diplomatic ties. You observe the king, still grief-stricken in his fashion, but already setting his sights on the next potential bride. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, a brilliant but ultimately doomed architect of the English Reformation, takes on the unenviable task of finding Henry a suitable match. The pool of eligible princesses, especially Protestant ones, or those from politically advantageous families, is not as vast as one might imagine. And here, the seeds of a truly bizarre chapter begin to sprout. Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, identifies Anne of Cleves, sister of the Duke of Cleves, a minor German principality. The potential alliance with the Schmalkaldic League, a group of Protestant German states, is enticing in the face of Catholic threats from France and the Holy Roman Empire. The problem, however, arises from the rather limited technology of the time. There's no zoom, no high-resolution photographs, certainly no video calls. So, how does one assess a potential bride across hundreds of miles? Through portraits. Hans Holbein the Younger, the renowned court painter, is dispatched to Cleves to capture Anne's likeness. You can imagine Holbein, a master of his craft, doing his absolute best to present a flattering yet accurate representation of the princess. His portrait, when it arrives back in England, is considered a triumph. It depicts a young woman with a pleasant, gentle face, modestly dressed, with a rather serene gaze. Henry, seeing this painting, is reportedly quite pleased. This is the mainstream historical fact of the disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves, a union based on a misleading, albeit skillfully rendered, image. You witness the king's excitement as Anne of Cleves finally arrives in England, ready for their first meeting. But then, a truly cringe-worthy moment unfolds. Henry, perhaps in a fit of romantic impulsiveness, decides to surprise his bride-to-be. He travels incognito to Rochester, eager to see her without the formality of court. You can almost feel the awkwardness, the tension in the air. He bursts into the room, expecting to sweep her off her feet, perhaps with a kiss. Instead, he finds himself face-to-face with a woman who, to his eyes, bears little resemblance to the beautiful portrait he had admired. This is where the quirky tidbit comes in, Henry's immediate and utter revulsion. He famously exclaimed, "I like her not," or words to that effect. He found her plain, her manners unrefined by English court standards, and her appearance utterly disappointing. Imagine the shock and horror on Anne's face, a young woman who barely spoke English, suddenly confronted by her future husband's undisguised disgust. You can almost hear the crickets chirping in the silence that followed. She was, in his words, a Flanders mare. It's a moment of brutal honesty, or perhaps brutal immaturity, from a powerful monarch used to immediate gratification. Despite his extreme distaste, the political wheels are already in motion. The marriage contract is signed. Henry, ever the one to find a loophole, quickly begins to regret his decision. He seeks any possible way out, claiming that the pre-contract and had with the Duke of Lorraine made their marriage invalid, or that he never truly consented to the union. The marriage is never consummated. You witness the farcical proceedings, the desperate attempts to invalidate the union, all under the thinly veiled guise of legality. Historians still argue whether Henry's intense dislike for Anne of Cleves was purely physical, a genuine aesthetic revulsion, or if it was amplified by political convenience, allowing him a graceful exit from an alliance that was no longer as strategically advantageous as it once seemed. Was her appearance truly so abhorrent? Or did she simply become a convenient scapegoat for a king who was already looking for his next romantic entanglement? The truth, as always, is probably a blend of both, a powerful king's personal taste conveniently aligning with political expediency. This marriage, short-lived and unconsummated, serves as a stark reminder that even kings, with all their power, can make incredibly awkward, deeply regrettable personal choices. The swift, almost comical, annulment of his marriage to Anne of Cleves leaves Henry VIII in a state of renewed marital readiness, and you observe his increasingly volatile temperament as he casts about for his next queen. The humiliating experience with Anne of Cleves seems to have left him even more determined to find a young, vibrant woman to rekindle his fading youth and provide him with more heirs, despite Edward being a healthy, if somewhat delicate boy. It's as if he's trying to recapture a sense of virility that is steadily slipping away. And into this increasingly unstable court steps Catherine Howard, a cousin of the ill-fated Boleyn. You see her not as a calculating schemer, but as a vivacious, impetuous young woman barely out of her teens. She is the epitome of youthful charm, full of life, and her spirited personality immediately captivates the aging, ailing king. Henry, by this point, is no longer the athletic, jousting hero of his youth. He is heavier, plagued by the leg ulcer that would define his later years, and increasingly reliant on others to help him move. Yet, Catherine's youthful energy seems to inject him with a temporary burst of vitality. Their marriage, in 1540, marks a brief, almost desperate, attempt by Henry to cling to the illusion of his own enduring power and attractiveness. You observe the king showering her with gifts, indulging her every whim, basking in her youthful presence. She is his rose without a thorn, a stark contrast to the intellectual challenges of Anne Boleyn or the quiet solemnity of Jane Seymour. For a while, the court is filled with music and dancing, as Catherine brings a lightness and joy that had been absent for years. This fleeting period of happiness, built on an increasingly fragile foundation, is a mainstream historical fact that highlights Henry's desperate search for a distraction from his own physical and mental decline. But Catherine, for all her charm, is ultimately ill-equipped for the treacherous currents of courtly life and the immense scrutiny that came with being Henry's queen. Her past, filled with youthful indiscretions and a lack of proper chaperoning, begins to catch up with her. You might notice the whispers, the nervous glances among courtiers who had witnessed her earlier flirtations and romantic entanglements. It was a court where every secret was a potential weapon, and Catherine, in her youthful naivete, had left too many vulnerabilities exposed. Here's a quirky tidbit that underscores the danger of her situation. Catherine, even as queen, continued to have secret rendezvous and flirtations, most notably with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. Imagine the sheer audacity, or perhaps recklessness, of a queen conducting clandestine meetings, often late at night, with a male courtier, literally in the royal palaces. It's almost unbelievable in its brazenness, a testament to her immaturity and lack of understanding of the ultimate consequences. The stakes for a queen found guilty of infidelity were, as Anne Boleyn had tragically demonstrated, incredibly high. It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion, knowing the inevitable outcome. As the accusations against Catherine Howard begin to surface, fueled by disgruntled former household staff and political rivals, you witness the king's initial disbelief turn to profound anguish, and then to explosive rage. He had projected his last hopes for youthful vitality onto her, and her perceived betrayal shattered that illusion completely. The charges of premarital sexual activity and postmarital adultery are brought to light, systematically destroying her reputation and her life. Historians still argue whether Catherine Howard was a calculating seductress who knowingly endangered her position, or simply a naive, thoughtless young woman whose past indiscretions caught up with her in a cruel and unforgiving environment. Was she a victim of her circumstances and her own youthful folly, or did she actively engage in behavior that she knew could be treasonous? You observe the grim testimonies, the king's heartbroken fury, and the rapid descent into inevitable tragedy. Her execution in February 1542, on the same spot as her cousin, and serves as a chilling reminder of the perils of being queen to a king whose grip on reality and mercy was steadily slipping away. The executions of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, brutal and swift, leave Henry VIII a profoundly changed man. You sense a deepening cynicism, a chilling weariness in the king. His faith in women, already precarious, is shattered, and his physical health, as you'll soon see, begins its irreversible decline. Yet, despite his emotional wounds and burgeoning physical ailments, the king remains deeply pragmatic. He still needs a queen, not necessarily for more children, but for companionship, for stability, and to maintain the image of a strong, settled monarchy. It is into this difficult role that Catherine Parr steps, becoming Henry's sixth and final wife in 1543. You observe her with a different lens from the previous queens. She is not young and impetuous like Catherine Howard, nor a dazzling intellectual like Anne Boleyn, nor even a demure ideal like Jane Seymour. Catherine Parr is a mature, twice-widowed woman of 31, a seasoned survivor of court life. She brings with her a quiet intelligence, a genuine piety, and a remarkable talent for diplomacy and nursing. She is, in essence, the perfect consort for an aging, increasingly difficult monarch. You watch as Catherine skillfully navigates the treacherous waters of Henry's court. She acts as a devoted nurse, tending to his festering leg ulcer and providing him with the comfort and companionship he desperately needs. More remarkably, she becomes a stepmother to his 3 children Mary, Elizabeth, and the young Edward. Anne successfully fosters a sense of familial harmony that had been sorely lacking. You might see her encouraging the children's studies, bringing them together, creating a semblance of a loving home. This ability to unite the fractured royal family is a mainstream historical fact that showcases her extraordinary diplomatic skills and nurturing spirit. Catherine is also a keen intellectual and a devout Protestant, though she is careful to express her reformist views in a way that doesn't overtly challenge the king's more conservative leanings. She promotes the reading of the Bible in English, writes and publishes religious books, and uses her influence to encourage education. She truly embodies a blend of piety and practicality, understanding the limits of her position while still subtly advocating for her beliefs. Here's a quirky tidbit about Catherine Parr. She was a published author, a truly rare feat for a woman in her time, especially a queen. Her work, Prayers or Meditations, became a bestseller, a collection of devotional writings that showcased her deep spirituality and intellectual prowess. Imagine the queen, in between tending to the king and managing the royal household, finding time to write and then oversee the printing and distribution of her own book. It's a testament to her drive and her commitment to her faith. It also speaks to the growing literacy and intellectual curiosity of the age, even within the confines of the court. Despite her cautious nature, Catherine Parr nearly fell victim to the king's paranoia and the machinations of her conservative religious opponents. You might hear whispers of a plot against her, led by those who feared her reformist influence. They managed to convince Henry that she was too radical, too challenging to his theological views. An arrest warrant was actually drawn up. You can almost feel the tension as her life hangs by a thread. But Catherine, using her keen wit and diplomatic skill, manages to talk her way out of danger. She approaches the king, feigning humility and assuring him that her discussions of theology were only ever to learn from his supreme wisdom. Henry, flattered and perhaps genuinely fond of her, relents. Historians still argue whether Catherine Parr's survival was purely due to her shrewd intelligence and quick thinking, or if Henry's genuine affection for her, combined with his increasingly poor health and need for her care, ultimately saved her. Was it calculated survival or true attachment? You observe the delicate dance she performs, managing the king's volatile temper and increasingly erratic behavior, often with a knowing glance that only a true survivor could possess. She was the one who could soothe the increasingly monstrous king, a skill that literally saved her life and allowed her to outlast him. As Catherine Parr quietly assumes her role, stabilizing the royal household, you begin to notice the increasingly alarming transformation of Henry VIII himself. The vibrant, athletic prince you observe at the outset of his reign is now, unmistakably, a shadow of his former self. His body, once a source of strength and pride, has become a testament to decay, a physical manifestation of his internal turmoil and unchecked indulgences. This decline is not sudden. It's a slow, grinding process that you've been observing through the previous sections, reaching its agonizing zenith in these final years. The most striking visual change is his immense weight gain. You see him struggling to move, his once imposing stature now bloated and unwieldy. He's no longer riding in justs or dancing at court. Instead, he relies on mechanical contraptions to move him or is carried by strong attendants. His face, once handsome and expressive, is now a jowly, often red and angry mask. The elaborate, richly embroidered clothes he still wears seem to stretch painfully across his corpulent frame. This dramatic physical transformation is a mainstream historical fact, often depicted in the portraits of his later years, a stark visual record of his health spiraling out of control. Beyond the visible weight gain, a multitude of ailments plague him. You might notice the labored breathing, the constant discomfort that lines his face. Headaches, fevers, and frequent, debilitating bouts of gout rack his body. The pain, you imagine, must have been excruciating, a constant companion that only fueled his already volatile temper. He demands silence, becomes agitated by perceived slights, and lashes out at those around him. The charming, witty intellectual has given way to a suffering, tyrannical brute, his once sharp mind clouded by pain and unchecked power. This physical deterioration has a profound impact on his mental state. His paranoia, always present, escalates dramatically. He becomes suspicious of everyone, even his most loyal servants and advisors. You might hear whispers of men being sent to the tower on the flimsiest of pretexts, of accusations of heresy or treason flung about like confetti. The court operates under a constant cloud of fear, never knowing who might be the next target of the king's unpredictable wrath. His once booming laughter is replaced by angry roars or sullen silences. Here's a quirky tidbit about his increasing immobility. Henry became so large that special mechanical devices, almost like early forms of stair lifts or hoists, had to be installed in his palaces to move him between floors. Imagine the king, the mighty monarch, being winched up and down, a cumbersome package of royal flesh. It's a rather undignified image, isn't it? The man who once vaulted into saddles with ease now needed mechanical assistance for the simplest movements, a stark visual representation of his physical decline. This reliance on such devices also hints at the sheer amount of staff required to manage his daily life, a constant retinue catering to his every need. As you observe his slow, agonizing decline, you might ponder the academic debates surrounding its cause. Historians still argue whether Henry VIII suffered from a specific, undiagnosed medical condition that contributed to his extreme weight gain and deteriorating health, beyond simply overeating. Was it type 2 diabetes brought on by his diet and lack of exercise? Or was it more likely a severe case of Cushing's syndrome, with its characteristic rapid weight gain, high blood pressure, and bone weakness? Or perhaps even something like traumatic brain injury from his jousting accidents, affecting his personality and metabolism? You see the medical texts of the era, crude by modern standards, offering little in the way of definitive diagnosis, leaving much to modern speculation. The cumulative effect of years of excessive feasting, heavy drinking, and a complete lack of physical activity, combined with a severe chronic leg injury, undoubtedly played a major role, but the specific underlying condition remains a subject of fascinating medical historical debate. The catalog of Henry VIII's ailments, as you've observed, is extensive, but one particular affliction stands out, becoming almost emblematic of his decaying reign: the ulcer on his leg. This isn't a mere cut or scrape. It's a festering, chronically infected wound that becomes the focal point of his physical agony, and perhaps a contributing factor to his increasingly foul temper. You watch as this insidious wound dictates his movements, limits his activities, and fills his private chambers with a most unpleasant odor. The origins of this persistent ulcer are largely traced back to a severe jousting accident in 1536. You might remember the king, that imposing figure of athletic prowess in his youth. During a tournament, his horse reportedly stumbled and fell, pinning the king beneath it. This was no minor tumble. Henry, encumbered by his heavy armor, was trapped for a considerable time, reportedly unconscious for 2 hours. This accident, a mainstream historical fact, is considered the turning point in his physical health. While he seemingly recovered from the immediate trauma, the injury to his leg, likely a deep contusion or even a compound fracture that didn't heal properly, never truly mended. From that point on, a chronic ulcer developed on his left thigh. You can imagine the excruciating pain, the constant irritation. In an age before modern antiseptics and antibiotics, such a wound would be a persistent battleground for infection. It would constantly weep pus and other fluids, requiring frequent, painful dressing changes. The treatments available to him were rudimentary at best: poultices of various herbs, washes, and bandages. You might even see the royal physicians, bewildered and largely ineffective, applying concoctions that probably did more harm than good, like applying crocodile dung sunscreen. Remember that from the ancient Egyptians? If they thought it might help. Though, thankfully, they likely stuck to more conventional, albeit still unhelpful, remedies of the time. The stench emanating from the wound must have been horrific, a constant presence in his private rooms, despite all efforts to mask it with perfumes and incense. You can almost smell the sickly sweet odor of decay, mingling with the heavy scent of musk and rosewater as you observe the cramped, increasingly airless chambers where he held court. This persistent, nauseating aroma contributed to his isolation, as many courtiers would have found it unbearable to be in his presence for long. It was a sensory assault that marked him, separating him from the world he so desperately wished to control. Here's a quirky tidbit about his treatment. In later years, Henry became convinced that the application of gold leaf to the wound would aid in its healing, believing in the mystical properties of the precious metal. Imagine the royal physicians, knowing full well it was likely useless, painstakingly applying delicate sheets of gold to his festering leg. It's a testament to the desperate measures taken, and the king's willingness to try anything, no matter how outlandish, to alleviate his constant pain. It's a moment of grim, almost darkly humorous, absurdity in the face of relentless suffering. As you witness the relentless progression of this terrible ailment, you might hear the quiet, scholarly discussions. Historians still argue whether the persistent pain and debilitating effects of Henry's leg ulcer were the primary drivers of his increasingly tyrannical and paranoid behavior in his later years, or if these were simply exacerbated by pre-existing personality traits and the immense pressures of kingship. Did the chronic pain literally make him mad, fueling his rage and suspicion, or was it merely a catalyst that accelerated a decline already set in motion by his absolute power and lack of accountability? You observe the evidence of his worsening temper, his impulsive decisions, and the rising death toll in his final decade, and it's hard not to connect the two. The festering wound became a physical manifestation of the corruption and decay that afflicted not just his body, but arguably his very soul. The festering leg ulcer and the cascade of physical ailments you've been observing didn't just make Henry VIII uncomfortable. they profoundly warped his mind. You've seen glimpses of it already: the quick rages, the short-lived affections, but in his final decade, his paranoia and tyranny escalate to terrifying heights, becoming the defining characteristics of his reign. The court transforms from a vibrant hub of intellectual and chivalric pursuits into a dangerous labyrinth of suspicion and fear, where a careless word could literally mean your head. You experience the chilling reality of life under the later Henry VIII. Gone is the jovial, generous monarch who would occasionally forgive slight. In his place sits a king consumed by distrust, his eyes constantly searching for betrayal. His once robust intellectual curiosity curdles into a rigid adherence to his own increasingly idiosyncratic beliefs. Any deviation, no matter how small, from his established religious doctrine, that fragile middle ground between Catholicism and full-blown Protestantism he meticulously crafted, is met with swift and brutal punishment. You might hear the hurried whispers of courtiers checking their loyalties, making sure their public pronouncements perfectly aligned with the king's current theological whims. The Tower of London, already a grim landmark, becomes even busier during these years. Executions are commonplace, often preceded by show trials designed more to rubber stamp the king's will than to deliver justice. You see figures who were once close to him, like Thomas Cromwell, the brilliant architect of the Reformation, fall from grace with terrifying speed. Cromwell, who had diligently served the king and helped him achieve his separation from Rome, is suddenly arrested on charges of treason and heresy and executed without trial. This rapid, arbitrary destruction of powerful figures is a mainstream historical fact that showcases the king's absolute and terrifying power in his final years. No one is truly safe. His paranoia extends beyond the political and religious spheres. You might observe his growing suspicion of his own household, his doctors, even his closest friends. He fears plots against his life, poisoning, and any perceived challenge to his authority. This fear, often unfounded, leads to erratic and cruel decisions, further isolating him in his own increasingly elaborate yet stifling palaces. The vibrant court, full of laughter and music in its early years, is now marked by a chilling silence, broken only by the king's booming voice or the hurried footsteps of servants trying to avoid his wrath. Here's a quirky tidbit that perfectly illustrates his paranoia. Henry VIII became so obsessed with the idea of being poisoned that he supposedly developed an acute sense of smell, believing he could detect venom in his food and drink. Imagine the poor tasters, whose job it was to sample the king's meals before he ate, living in constant terror. But Henry, ever the one to take an extra precaution, would sniff his own food with exaggerated scrutiny, convinced he had a unique ability to detect deadly compounds. It's a rather macabre twist on a royal privilege, isn't it? One can almost pity the chefs, constantly trying to prepare meals that would appease his increasingly finicky and fearful palate. As you witness this descent into tyranny, you might quietly listen to the debates among scholars. Historians still argue whether Henry VIII was genuinely mad in his final years, suffering from a form of dementia or brain damage exacerbated by his physical ailments, or if his extreme behavior was a calculated, albeit cruel, exercise of unchecked absolute power. Was he simply an ill, aging despot, or was there a true psychological breakdown? You observe his increasingly irrational decisions, his bursts of illogical fury, and the sudden shifts in his affections and allegiances. It's a terrifying portrait of a man unburdened by accountability, his power absolute, and his mind seemingly unhinged by pain and decades of unrestrained indulgence. The line between sickness and tyranny blurs, creating a truly horrifying final act for England's once golden king. You have observed Henry VIII's reign, from its glorious dawn to its increasingly grim twilight, marked by physical decay and psychological tyranny. Now, as our narrative draws to its close, you are witness to the very final agonizing moments of the king, a monarch literally consumed by his own body and the consequences of his absolute power. The year is 1547, and the mighty Henry, once the embodiment of virility, is now a decaying hulk of a man, barely clinging to life. His final days are a testament to chronic suffering. You see him confined to his bed, or perhaps propped up in a chair, his immense weight making any movement excruciating. The festering leg ulcer, by now, is a gaping, putrid wound, constantly weeping and emitting a foul stench that even the most potent perfumes cannot mask. Gout attacks render him screaming in agony. His breathing is shallow and ragged, his face bloated and often purplish from dropsy, a swelling caused by fluid retention. He is riddled with pain, sleeplessness, and the constant, dull ache of chronic illness. Despite his extreme physical weakness, his mental state remains volatile, punctuated by bursts of his old fury. He continues to issue commands, to cling to the reins of power with a desperate, dying grip. Courtiers tiptoe around him, terrified of provoking his wrath, even in his diminished state. No one dares to speak of his impending death, for fear of being accused of treason or worse. The atmosphere in his private chambers is thick with apprehension, a heavy cloak of silence broken only by the king's labored breaths or the rustle of robes as attendants move cautiously around him. The king's death, when it finally comes, is not a quiet passing. It is a struggle. On January 28th, 1547, in the early hours of the morning, Henry VIII finally succumbs to his myriad ailments. The immediate cause of death is often attributed to heart failure, brought on by his extreme obesity and chronic conditions. This agonizing, slow decline, culminating in his death, is a mainstream historical fact, albeit one shrouded in the terror and secrecy of the time. You imagine the hushed pronouncements, the swift locking away of keys, as the powerful men of the court maneuver to secure their positions before the news of the king's demise is officially announced. And here's a quirky tidbit about his final moments. Legend has it that his last words were a mournful, drawn-out cry of monks. Monks, a possible allusion to his guilt over the dissolution of the monasteries and his break with Rome. While highly apocryphal and likely invented by later Catholic propagandists, it's a fascinating thought, isn't it? The idea of the dying king, haunted by the religious upheaval he unleashed, perhaps reflecting on his life's most profound decision. Whether true or not, it speaks to the lasting impact of his actions and the psychological weight of his choices. You can almost see the faint, fleeting flicker of regret in his eyes, just before they lose their light. As you stand witness to the king's last breath, you might hear the quiet, speculative whispers among historians. Historians still argue whether Henry VIII truly had a sudden, final realization or moment of clarity regarding his religious actions and personal sins on his deathbed, or if his final thoughts were simply incoherent ramblings from a body ravaged by illness. Was there genuine spiritual remorse, a final turning back towards the faith he had abandoned, or was it merely the fading consciousness of a man in immense pain? You see the accounts, often colored by the religious leanings of their authors, painting conflicting pictures of his spiritual state in those final hours. Regardless of his internal struggle, the physical end was undeniably grim, a long drawn-out decay that reflected the destructive nature of his reign. With his last breath, an era ends, paving the way for a fragile new future under his young son, Edward. The death of Henry VIII, while a relief to many, did not immediately bring peace or dignity to the king's remains. You continue your silent vigil, observing the macabre and surprisingly undignified aftermath of his passing. For a monarch who had orchestrated so much death and upheaval, whose final years were marked by grotesque physical decay, his own post-mortem fate would be oddly fitting, almost a final, bizarre humiliation. His body, by this point, was enormous, swollen by dropsy and the accumulation of years of gluttony. Embalming was attempted, but the sheer volume of his corpulent remains, combined with the hot and humid conditions of January in a poorly ventilated royal palace, meant that the process was far from perfect. You can imagine the grim task facing the undertakers, trying to prepare a body of such immense size and in such an advanced state of deterioration. The air in the death chamber would have been thick with the smell of death and the strong, cloying scents of spices and preservatives attempting to mask it. According to protocol, Henry's body was placed in a lead coffin, which was then encased in a wooden one. This heavy casket was then laid in state in the Chapel Royal at Whitehall Palace, awaiting transport to Windsor for burial. It was here, during its overnight stop at Sion Abbey, a former monastery he had dissolved, ironically, that the most infamous and unsavory incident occurred. This unexpected, almost karmic, event is a mainstream historical fact often recounted with a mixture of grim amusement and morbid fascination. A story originating from a chronicle written by John Fox, an ardent Protestant, recounts that during the night, some of the bodily fluids from the king's coffin began to leak, oozing out onto the chapel floor. This horrifying seepage attracted a dog, which then began to lick up the royal effluent. You can almost see the horrified faces of the guards, trying to shoo away the animal, as the decaying king, in death, suffered a final, unspeakable indignity. This is where the quirky tidbit of a prophecy comes into play. Years earlier, a Franciscan friar, William Peto, had reportedly confronted Henry and prophesied that the dogs would lick his blood as they did Ahab's, a reference to the biblical king Ahab who met a gruesome end. Whether Peto truly made this prophecy, or if it was retroactively invented to fit the circumstances, it became a powerful and enduring legend. Imagine the chilling resonance of that prophecy in the minds of those who witnessed the scene at Sion Abbey. It was as if divine judgment, or at least a darkly poetic justice, had finally caught up with the king. The image of the dog lapping up the royal fluids is a visceral, unforgettable one, a stark contrast to the grand funeral pomp befitting a king. As the coffin was finally transported to Windsor for burial in St. George's Chapel, you envision the solemn procession, the outward display of mourning masking the inner turmoil and relief felt by many. He was interred next to his beloved Jane Seymour, as he had wished. But even in death, his body refused to rest entirely. Historians still argue whether the story of the leaking coffin and the dog at Sion Abbey is entirely factual, a true historical event, or if it was exaggerated or even fabricated by Protestant chroniclers like Fox to discredit the deceased king and highlight divine retribution for his actions against the church. Was it an inconvenient truth or a convenient piece of propaganda? You see the accounts, often told with a certain relish by those who despise his reign, and it's difficult to separate the gruesome reality from the embellished legend. Regardless, the tale endures, adding a final, undignified flourish to the bizarre death of Henry VIII, ensuring that even in his grave, he remained a subject of macabre fascination. With the grisly details of Henry VIII's death and undignified burial behind us, you now have the opportunity to reflect on the immense and often contradictory legacy he left behind. His reign, spanning 38 years, fundamentally reshaped England, transforming its political landscape, its religious identity, and even the very concept of kingship. You've seen his journey from the Golden Prince to the monstrous tyrant, and now, from a distance, you can begin to comprehend the lasting impact of that complex trajectory. Perhaps his most undeniable legacy, a mainstream historical fact, is the English Reformation. Regardless of his personal motivations, whether it was truly a quest for a male heir, a matter of theological conviction, or simply a desperate grasp for absolute power, Henry's decision to break with Rome irrevocably changed England's spiritual destiny. You see the immediate consequences: the dissolution of the monasteries, the shift in power from the Pope to the monarch, the establishment of the Church of England, albeit initially a very Catholic one in doctrine. This act set England on a distinct path, away from the Catholic dominance of continental Europe, influencing everything from its foreign policy to its national identity for centuries to come. Imagine trying to unravel those threads. It's practically impossible. Beyond a religious upheaval, Henry centralized royal power to an unprecedented degree. You witnessed his ruthless efficiency in crushing dissent, his mastery of parliamentary manipulation, and his creation of a powerful privy council that served his will. He transformed England from a feudal kingdom with powerful nobles into a more recognizably modern state, with the monarch at its undisputed head. This strengthening of the crown, while often achieved through brutal means, laid the groundwork for future strong monarchs like Elizabeth I. You can almost feel the weight of the crown settling more firmly on the monarch's head after Henry's reign. Yet, for all his monumental achievements, Henry left behind a deeply fractured and unstable kingdom. His constant religious shifts, his bewildering changes in doctrine, and his penchant for executing those who disagreed with him created a climate of fear and uncertainty. You might sense the lingering trauma in the faces of those who survived his reign, the quiet caution in their movements. The succession itself, despite his desperate pursuit of a male heir, was far from stable, leading to the tumultuous reigns of his three children, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. Here's a quirky tidbit about his linguistic legacy. Henry VIII was obsessed with the idea of a strong, unified English identity, and part of that extended to the English language itself. He encouraged the use of English in official documents and, crucially, authorized the publication of the Great Bible in English, making Scripture accessible to a wider audience. This had a profound, if indirect, effect on the development and standardization of the English language, solidifying its place as the language of the nation. It's almost ironic that a man whose personal life was so chaotic contributed to such an organized linguistic foundation. It's like a meticulously structured garden appearing in the middle of a war zone. As you consider the vastness of his impact, you might find yourself drawn into one of the oldest and most enduring historical debates about him. Historians still argue whether Henry VIII was a visionary statesman who shrewdly navigated the complex politics of his era to forge a modern, independent England, or if he was simply a self-serving tyrant whose personal desires and insecurities led to unintentional, yet revolutionary, outcomes. Was he a genius of statecraft, or merely a destructive force who stumbled into greatness by accident? You see the arguments laid out, meticulously crafted on both sides, and it's clear that there's no single, easy answer. He was a man of immense contradictions, a cultured intellectual and a brutal despot, a devoted father and a serial wife killer, a theological reformer and a conservative traditionalist. His legacy, much like his life, remains a fascinating, disturbing, and endlessly debated tapestry of power, religion, and human failing. You've traveled through the tumultuous life and bizarre death of Henry VIII, from the hopeful dawn of his reign to its putrid, painful close. Now, as the echoes of his era begin to soften, you can appreciate how the events of his time, and the man himself, continue to ripple through history, sparking endless curiosity and scholarly debate. The questions his reign raises aren't just confined to dusty textbooks. They resonate even today, influencing how we understand power, religion, and the human condition. One of the most enduring historical echoes of Henry VIII's reign is the ongoing debate about the nature of royal power. His assertion of absolute authority, the creation of a powerful state, and the idea of the monarch as the supreme head of both church and state profoundly shaped the trajectory of English monarchy. You can see his influence in later struggles between crown and parliament, particularly during the English Civil War, where the very limits of royal authority were violently contested. The ghost of Henry's absolutism, in a way, haunted the ambitions of kings for centuries. This enduring influence on the concept of sovereignty is a mainstream historical fact that continues to inform political thought. Beyond the political, the religious landscape he created still exists. The Church of England, born from his personal crisis, remains a distinct entity, its identity forever intertwined with the complexities of its foundation. You might ponder how different the world might be if Henry had received his annulment from Rome, or if he had simply reconciled with Catherine of Aragon. The trajectory of Western Europe, the rise of Protestantism, and the very concept of national churches could have been dramatically altered. It's a vast what-if that stretches across centuries. His personal life, so full of drama and tragedy, also continues to captivate. The stories of his 6 wives have inspired countless books, plays, and films, turning them into figures of enduring fascination. You see the echoes of their personalities and fates in popular culture, from the shrewd survivor Catherine Parr to the doomed intellectual and Bullen, to the tragic youth Catherine Howard. They are not merely historical figures. They have become archetypes, embodying ambition, resilience, and vulnerability in the face of absolute power. Here's a quirky tidbit that demonstrates the lasting pull of his story. Even in the modern era, Henry VIII palaces like Hampton Court remain hugely popular tourist attractions. Visitors flock to see the very rooms where these dramatic events unfolded, seeking a tangible connection to the past. You can imagine people standing in the Great Hall, trying to picture the king at his feasts, or wandering through the corridors, almost expecting to hear the rustle of a courtier's silk gown or the distant echo of Henry's booming voice. It's a strange phenomenon, this desire to experience the tangible remnants of such a distant and often horrifying past. The very walls seem to hum with the lingering energy of those lives. Finally, as we drift away from the direct story, you're left with the profound, lingering question that historians endlessly turn over. Historians still argue whether Henry VIII was ultimately a destructive force whose personal desires unleashed chaos and suffering, or if he was an unwitting, yet crucial, catalyst for necessary societal change and the emergence of a modern English identity. Was his reign a period of brutal consolidation, or was it a painful but essential step towards religious and political autonomy? You see the endless array of interpretations, the constant re-examination of evidence, and the new perspectives that emerge with each generation of scholars. It's a testament to the enduring complexity of the man and his era, a story that refuses to be neatly packaged or definitively concluded. Now, as the long, strange journey through Henry VIII's life fades into the quiet corners of your mind, allow yourself to gently drift. The details, the dates, the debates, let them soften. Feel your breath deepen, becoming slow and even. The ancient stone walls of the palaces, the whispers of the past, they are fading now, dissolving into the peaceful darkness around you. The imposing figure of the king, in all his grandeur and his grotesque decay, is retreating, becoming a distant echo. There's nothing left to worry about. No more grand historical dramas to unfold. No more gruesome details to ponder. Just the gentle hum of the fan, the softness of your bed, and the quiet stillness of the night. Let your thoughts grow lighter, softer, until they, too, vanish. The history is done, the lessons learned, and now it's time for rest. Let sleep, sweet and profound, finally claim you.